The letter did not announce a death. That was, perhaps, the most surprising thing about it. In Penelope Kelhurst's experience, sealed correspondence delivered by a liveried footman from a carriage bearing an unfamiliar crest usually meant ruin of one sort or another. This, however, was something else entirely. Her father read the single sheet of heavy cream paper, his face slackening from its usual state of anxious tension into one of pure, uncomprehending shock. He read it twice, then a third time. "Penelope," he whispered, his voice dry as dust. He held the letter out to her, his hand trembling so violently the paper rattled. "Read this." She took it. The writing was a clerk's hand, precise and impersonal. The words themselves were just as stark. It was a proposal, not of courtship, but of contract. A business arrangement laid out in the language of finance and obligation. His Grace, the Duke of Velmore, required a wife. The specifications were listed as if for the purchase of fine livestock. The lady must be of gentle birth. She must be possessed of a quiet and tractable nature. Her reputation must be beyond the smallest whisper of reproach. She must be prepared to undertake the duties of a duchess with diligence and without complaint. In return, the Duke of Velmore was prepared to settle, in their entirety, the outstanding debts of one Mr. Thomas Kelhurst. A figure was named, a figure so staggering that Penelope felt the air leave her lungs in a short, sharp gasp. It was a sum that would not only rescue them from the debtor's prison that had loomed for months, but would secure her father's comfort for the rest of his days. The letter concluded with an instruction. Should the terms be agreeable, Miss Penelope Kelhurst was to present herself with her father at Velmore House in London in 2 days' time. She looked up from the page, her gaze meeting her father's. His eyes, normally a washed-out blue, were filled with a desperate, pleading hope. It was the look of a drowning man who has just been thrown a rope. "The Duke of Velmore," she said, the name feeling foreign and heavy on her tongue. She knew of him, of course. Everyone did. A man of immense wealth and ancient title, who had become a recluse following the tragic death of his younger brother some months prior. He was a shadow in society, a name whispered in connection with grief and immense fortune. "They say he is difficult," her father murmured, though the protest was weak, a token gesture against the overwhelming tide of relief washing over him. "Cold?" Penelope folded the letter, her fingers precise, creasing the paper along its original lines. Cold. Difficult. What did that matter? Her father had gambled and speculated and borrowed their lives into a corner from which there was no escape. He had wept at her feet, a broken man, only a week ago. She had held his shaking shoulders and promised him she would find a way. She had not known the way would look like this. It was not a choice. It was a transaction. Her life, her name, her future, in exchange for his. She placed the letter on the small, scarred table between them. "I will need to have my grey dress pressed," she said, her voice even. "It is the most suitable one I own." Her father stared at her, tears welling in his eyes. "Penelope, my child, I never—" She did not let him finish. She had learned long ago that his apologies were as empty as his pockets. They were sounds he made to soothe his own conscience, not to mend the wounds he inflicted. She rose from her chair. "We have 2 days to prepare," she said, her tone leaving no room for argument or for the performance of his regret. "We should not be late." she left him there, clutching the promise of his salvation, and went to her room. She did not cry. She had learned a long time ago that tears were exactly what her father expected. They were part of the ritual of his failure and her forgiveness. But this was different. This was not about forgiveness. This was about payment. And she, it seemed, was the price. Velmore House was not a house. It was a palace of pale stone that consumed half of a London square, its cold, classical facade staring down at the city with an air of aristocratic indifference. The footman who had delivered the letter met them at the door and led them through a hall of marble and silence. Their footsteps echoed. There were no flowers, no sign of life, only the ticking of a great long-case clock that seemed to be counting down the seconds of Penelope's freedom. They were shown into a library. It was a vast two-story room, lined from floor to ceiling, with books bound in dark leather. A fire burned in the grate, but it offered no warmth. The air was chilled, still. At a massive desk of dark, polished mahogany sat a man. The Duke of Velmore. He rose as they entered. He was taller than she had expected, and leaner. He was dressed in black, from his perfectly tied cravat to his polished boots. It was the colour of mourning, but on him it looked like a uniform. His hair was black, his eyes a startling pale grey, the colour of a winter sky before a storm. He was brutally, icily handsome, a man carved from unforgiving stone. "Mr. Kelhurst, Miss Kelhurst," he said. His voice was a low baritone, devoid of any inflection. He did not offer his hand. He gestured to the two chairs placed before his desk. "Please be seated." They sat. The leather was cold against Penelope's back. Her father began to stammer, a string of thanks and apologies and effusive pronouncements, but the Duke cut him off with a small, sharp motion of his hand. "That will not be necessary, sir," he said, his gaze fixed not on her father, but on Penelope. It was an unnerving gaze, not predatory, not even interested. It was assessing, as if he were examining a piece of porcelain for flaws. "I trust you have understood the terms of my proposal." "Yes, Your Grace." "Entirely, Your Grace," her father said quickly. The Duke's attention remained on her. "And you, Miss Kelhurst, do you understand the terms?" Penelope met his gaze without flinching. She would not be cowed. She was a party to this contract, not merely the goods being exchanged. "I understand that you require a Duchess to manage your household and bear your name. In exchange, you will erase my father's debts." Something flickered in those grey eyes. Not approval. Not quite. Perhaps surprise that she had not lowered her gaze, or dissolved into maidenly confusion. "Precisely," he said. "It is a partnership, one of mutual convenience. I have recently inherited responsibilities I did not anticipate. My households in London and in the country are in disarray. I require a woman of sense and discretion to impose order. I require a hostess who can perform her duties without involving me in the frivolities of society. I require an heir." He listed the requirements as if reading from an inventory. Each word was a small, cold stone dropped into the silence of the room. "You should know," he continued, his voice dropping slightly, "that I will not be a husband in the conventional sense. My time is my own. My life is my own. You will have my name, my protection, and a generous allowance. You will want for nothing in a material sense, but you will not have my affection. I have none to give." It was a warning, a final chance to retreat. Her father shifted uncomfortably in his chair, but Penelope sat perfectly still. She had expected this. The coldness was not a surprise. It was a confirmation. This man was not buying a wife. He was hiring a manager. "I understand, Your Grace," she said. He held her gaze for 3 seconds. 4. 5. He was searching for something. A crack in her composure. A hint of fear. She gave him nothing. She had learned to build walls around herself long ago. Her father's chaotic life had been an excellent teacher. Finally, he gave a curt nod. "Very well." He turned to his man of business, a small grey man who had been standing silently by the window. "Mr. Davies, the papers." Documents were produced. Contracts were signed. Her father's hand was a frantic scrawl. Hers was steady. When it was done, the Duke stood. "The wedding will be in 3 days. A special license. It will be a private ceremony here, in the chapel. You and your father will take rooms at a hotel. My man of business will arrange it. Send the bills to him." He was already turning away, his attention shifting back to the papers on his desk. The interview was over. Her father, giddy with relief, began to bow and scrape his way out of the room. Penelope rose and curtsied. "Your Grace." He did not look up. "Duchess," he said, the word a correction, a statement of her new and unalterable reality. As she followed her father out of the silent, cold library, Penelope felt a strange sense of calm. The uncertainty was over. The fear of imminent ruin was gone. She had a new role to play, the Duchess of Velmore. It was a part that required dignity, restraint, and a great deal of work. It did not require love. In that, at least, the Duke had been honest. It was a relief. Love was a complication she could not afford. The wedding was as cold and efficient as the contract that had preceded it. It took place in a small stone chapel at the back of Velmore House. The only attendees were her father, the Duke's solicitor, and a formidable old woman with eyes as sharp and grey as the Duke's own. She was introduced as the Dowager Duchess of Velmore, his grandmother. She watched the entire proceeding with an unnerving stillness, her face a mask of aristocratic neutrality. Penelope wore her grey dress. The Duke wore black. He spoke his vows in a clear, low voice, his words echoing in the cold air. When it was her turn, Penelope's voice was just as steady. She was making a promise not to a man, but to a position. She would uphold her end of the bargain. When the vicar pronounced them man and wife, there was a beat of awkward silence. The Duke did not lean in to kiss her. He simply took her hand, his gloved fingers cool and impersonal, and raised it halfway to his lips before letting it drop. It was a gesture of ownership, not affection. A wedding breakfast had been laid out in a small formal dining room. Her father, his debts now a thing of the past, was jovial, attempting to engage his new son-in-law in conversation. The Duke responded with monosyllabic answers, his gaze distant. The Dowager Duchess, Persis, said almost nothing, but Penelope felt the old woman's eyes on her constantly. Finally, her father departed, his future secure. Penelope was left alone with her new husband and his grandmother. "Well," the Dowager said, her voice crisp. "That is that." She looked from her grandson to Penelope. Dominic, you have duties at Whitehall. Do not neglect them on my account." It was a dismissal. The Duke inclined his head. "Grandmother." He glanced at Penelope. "The housekeeper, Mrs. Graves, will show you to your rooms. She has been instructed to answer any questions you may have." And then he was gone, leaving Penelope alone with the dowager. The old woman surveyed her for a long moment. "So, you are the new Duchess." "I am, Your Grace." "You do not look like a duchess," the dowager observed, not unkindly. "You look like a frightened mouse in a very large, very empty cage." Penelope met her gaze. "I am not frightened, Your Grace. And I am not a mouse." A flicker of interest in the dowager's sharp eyes. "No? Good. Mice do not last long in this house." She tapped a finger on the table. "My grandson is a difficult man. He was not always this way. Grief has frozen him. His brother's death broke something inside him." "I am aware of the tragedy," Penelope said quietly. "Are you?" The dowager's gaze was piercing. "The world knows that Lawrence St. Clair died in a riding accident. They call it a tragedy. They do not know the half of it. Lawrence was the sun. Dominic was the stone. The sun shone on the stone, and the stone was warmed by it. Now the sun is gone." She paused, letting the words settle. "He has married you for a purpose. To be a buffer between him and the world. To run his houses so that he does not have to think of them. To give him an heir so that the line does not die with him. Do you understand this?" "I do." "And you accepted these terms?" "I did." The Dowager Duchess leaned back in her chair, a small, almost imperceptible nod. "You have courage, I will grant you that. Or perhaps you are simply a pragmatist." "Perhaps I am both, Your Grace." For the first time, something moved at the corner of the old woman's mouth. Not quite a smile. The almost. "Perhaps you are." "Very well, Penelope. Welcome to Velmore. Mrs. Graves is waiting. Your duties begin now." The rooms assigned to her were a suite. A sitting room, a bedroom, and a dressing room, all decorated in muted shades of blue and cream. They were beautiful, opulent, and utterly impersonal. They felt like rooms in an expensive hotel. A door in the sitting room, she was told, connected to the Duke's own suite. The door was closed. She suspected it would remain so. Mrs. Graves, the housekeeper, was a tall, severe woman who had been with the family for 40 years. She presented Penelope with a set of account books and a stack of household keys. "His Grace wishes for you to review the expenditures, Your Grace," the housekeeper said, her tone respectful but cool, "and to conduct an inventory. The staff is at your disposal." And so Penelope began her work. She spent the next several days walking the silent, echoing halls of Velmore House. She learned that there were 57 rooms, 312 windows, and a staff of 42. She learned that Mrs. Graves was in the kitchen every morning at 8, that the maid Agnes was curious but kind, that the gardener Thomas hardly ever spoke. She learned the geography of her new life, the public rooms, grand and cold, the servants' corridors, bustling and warm, the Duke's study, a fortress she did not dare approach, and her own rooms, a quiet, lonely island. She saw her husband only at dinner. They sat at opposite ends of a dining table, so long it felt like they were in different rooms. The expanse of polished mahogany and gleaming silver between them, was a tangible representation of the distance in their marriage. They spoke little. He would ask if her day had been productive. She would answer that it had. He would inquire if she had everything she needed. She would assure him she did. The conversations were sterile, exercises in formality. He never looked at her. Not really. His eyes seemed to look through her, his thoughts 1,000 miles away. One afternoon, in the main drawing room, she encountered a visitor, a young woman of breathtaking beauty, with hair the color of spun gold, and eyes the blue of a summer sky. She was dressed in the height of fashion, a vision of vibrant life in the muted stillness of the house. "You must be the new Duchess," the woman said, her voice light and musical. She smiled, a dazzling, perfect smile. "I am Theodosia Beaumont, a friend of the family." Penelope knew the name. She had heard the maids whispering it. Miss Beaumont had been engaged to Lawrence, the Duke's late brother. "It is a pleasure to meet you, Miss Beaumont," Penelope said. "Oh, please, you must call me Theodosia. We are to be family, of a sort." She looked around the drawing room with a proprietary air. "This house has been so sad since dear Lawrence passed. Dominic, poor man, has been utterly lost. I do my best to keep his spirits up, and the dowager's, but it is a trial." The way she said it implied a deep, shared intimacy of grief from which Penelope was excluded. She made it sound as though she, not Penelope, were the true lady of the house. "His Grace is fortunate to have such a good friend," Penelope said, her tone neutral. Theodosia's smile tightened just a fraction. "He is. We understand each other, you see. We share a loss that no one else can comprehend." She let her gaze sweep over Penelope's simple grey gown. It was a subtle, but unmistakable dismissal. "I do hope you will be happy here, Your Grace. It is a very large house to be lonely in." With another brilliant smile, she swept from the room, leaving a trail of expensive French perfume in her wake. Penelope stood alone in the vast, silent drawing room. She did not feel lonely. She did not feel intimidated. She felt determined. This was her house now, her responsibility. Theodosia Beaumont, the ghost of the lost brother, the silent, grieving Duke. They were all part of the landscape she now had to manage. She had made a bargain, and Penelope Kelhurst always kept her bargains. We'll take a very short break. If you don't want to miss new stories, please subscribe to the channel. The days in London settled into a strange, quiet rhythm. Penelope rose early, met with Mrs. Graves, and spent her mornings immersed in the ledgers and accounts of the vast Velmore estate. It was a challenge she found surprisingly satisfying. Her father's chaotic finances had taught her the importance of order, and she brought a fierce, quiet efficiency to the task. She discovered extravagances that could be trimmed, suppliers who were overcharging, and small inefficiencies that, when corrected, saved a surprising amount of money. She did not consult the Duke on these matters. His instructions had been clear. She was to manage his household. And so she did. She made decisions, gave orders, and slowly, methodically, began to impose her own brand of quiet order on the sprawling, melancholic house. The staff, initially wary, began to respond to her. They were accustomed to the Duke's remote disinterest and the Dowager's sharp, infrequent commands. Penelope was different. She was present. She learned their names. She knew the scullery maid's sister was ill, that the head groom's son was hoping for an apprenticeship. She did not pry, but she listened. And when she could, she helped in small, practical ways. Her relationship with the Dowager Duchess, Persis, also began to shift. The old woman would summon her for tea once or twice a week. At first, the conversations were a form of interrogation, with Persis probing for any sign of weakness or frivolity. But as the weeks passed, the tone softened. "Mrs. Graves tells me you have reduced the butcher's bill by nearly a quarter," Persis remarked one afternoon, peering at Penelope over her teacup. "The previous arrangement was not advantageous, Your Grace." "And you dismissed one of the footmen." "He was drinking the Duke's brandy." Persis set her cup down. "Good. The boy was a fool. My grandson would never have noticed." She paused. "You are a sensible young woman, Penelope. More sensible than I expected." It was the highest form of praise the Dowager was capable of giving. Dinners with Dominic remained the same cold, formal ritual. Yet something had begun to change. One evening, after weeks of sitting at opposite ends of the cavernous table, Penelope gave an order to the footman. Before dinner, they were to remove half the leaves from the table, shortening it considerably. When Dominic entered the dining room that evening, he stopped short. The table was now an intimate size. Their places were set only a few feet apart. He looked at the table, then at her, a question in his pale eyes. "I find it difficult to converse over such a distance, Your Grace," Penelope said simply, taking her seat. "I feared we were shouting." He did not reply, but as he sat down, something moved at the corner of his mouth. The almost smile. It was there for a second, a fleeting ghost of an expression, and then it was gone. But she had seen it. They did not speak much more than usual that evening. But the silence felt different. Less a chasm, more a shared space. When the meal was over, he held the door for her. It was a small, almost unconscious gesture of courtesy, but it was the first he had ever shown her. Theodosia Beaumont remained a persistent presence. She would call at the house several times a week, always dressed in the latest fashion. Her manner a bright, brittle performance of cheerful sympathy. She treated Penelope with a flawless, condescending politeness that was more insulting than any open rudeness. "You are looking a little pale, Your Grace," she would say, her eyes scanning Penelope's simple dress with pity. "London can be so draining. You must allow me to take you driving in the park. You need to be seen, you know. People are beginning to talk." "I have a great deal of work to do, Miss Beaumont," Penelope would reply evenly. "I have no time for the park." Theodosia would sigh dramatically. "Of course, you are so very diligent. Dominic is lucky to have found someone so practical. Lawrence, you know, he always said a house needed laughter, not just efficiency." Every conversation was a battlefield. Every mention of Lawrence was a carefully aimed dart, designed to remind Penelope of her status as an outsider, a functional necessity in a world of deep, shared feeling she could never enter. Penelope never rose to the bait. She would listen with polite stillness, her composure a silent rebuke to Theodosia's carefully crafted provocations. As May turned to June, the season began to wane. The Dowager announced that the household would be removing to the country. "It is time to go to Thornhurst," she declared one morning. "London is a furnace in the summer, and Dominic needs the country air. He is looking like a ghost." Penelope felt a flicker of something she dared not name: anticipation. Velmore House was a fortress, a public stage for her role as Duchess. Perhaps Thornhurst would be different. The journey to the country estate in Northumberland took several days. They travelled in a convoy of carriages, a moving city of servants, luggage, and supplies. Penelope travelled with the Dowager. The Duke rode alongside the carriage on a magnificent black stallion, a solitary, brooding figure against the rolling green of the English countryside. He rarely spoke, lost in his own world. Thornhurst was another world entirely. Unlike the cold, imposing stone of Velmore House, the estate was built of a warmer, honey-coloured brick, softened by centuries of ivy. It was a house that seemed to have grown from the land itself, nestled in a valley, and surrounded by ancient woods and rolling hills. But as they drew closer, Penelope could see the signs of neglect. The gardens were overgrown, the fences were in need of mending, the paint on the window frames was peeling. It was a beautiful place that was slowly succumbing to sadness. It felt like its master, wounded, withdrawn. The staff at Thornhurst greeted them with a mixture of relief and apprehension. They were a skeleton crew, accustomed to the master's long absences. Penelope, with the household keys now firmly in her possession, set to work. Here, her duties were different. They were not just about ledgers and accounts, but about the land itself. She spent her days walking the estate with the head groundskeeper, an old man named Miller, whose face was a map of the local weather. She learned about crop rotation, about the tenants' cottages that needed rethatching, about the woods that needed managing. Dominic, too, seemed different at Thornhurst. He spent his days riding, disappearing for hours on end, exploring the furthest reaches of his land. But when he returned, the sharp, defensive tension in his shoulders seemed to have eased, replaced by a simple weariness. The country air, as the Dowager had predicted, seemed to be doing him some good. Penelope discovered the library on her third day. It was her sanctuary. Unlike the formal, intimidating library in London, this one was comfortable, lived in. The chairs were worn, the air smelled of old paper and beeswax. It was here that she began to feel something akin to peace. She found a section on the history of the estate, on architecture and landscape design. She read about the St. Clair family, about the generations of dukes who had added to the house and shaped the land. She began to understand that Thornhurst was not just a property. It was a living thing, a legacy, and it was being allowed to fade. From his own solitary space, Dominic began to notice the changes. He had expected his new wife to be a quiet administrator, a ghost in the machine of his life. He had not expected her to be present. He saw her speaking with Miller, her head bent in serious conversation, a smudge of dirt on her cheek. He saw the new flower beds being dug near the house, the first sign of colour the gardens had seen in a year. He heard the staff talking. Her Grace had arranged for a doctor to see the stable boy's mother. Her Grace had authorized the purchase of new blankets for the tenant farmers. Small things, insignificant things. But they were things he had neglected, lost in the fog of his own grief. His brother, Lawrence, had loved Thornhurst. He had been the one with plans for it. grand plans for new follies, for a lake, for modernizing the farms. His death had put an end to all of it. For Dominic, the estate was a monument to his failure, a reminder of the brother he could not protect, the future that had been stolen from them. He had not had the heart to touch it. But this woman, his wife, she was touching it. Gently, carefully. She was not trying to erase the past. She was simply tending to the present. One evening, he returned late from his ride. The sun had set, and the house was quiet. As he passed through the main hall, he saw a light on in the library. He paused in the doorway, unseen. Penelope was curled in one of the large, worn armchairs by the fire, a book open in her lap. She was not reading. She was simply staring into the flames, her expression thoughtful, serene. She looked at home, as if she belonged there. The thought was unexpected. It sent a strange, unfamiliar warmth through his chest. For months, his house had been nothing but a collection of rooms filled with ghosts. Now, for the first time, it felt like a home again, because she was in it. He did not understand the feeling. He turned and walked away before she could see him, his heart pounding with a slow, heavy beat he had not felt in a very long time. A few days later, Penelope was exploring the west wing of the house. It was quieter here, the air thick with dust. She came upon a heavy oak door at the end of a corridor. It was locked. Agnes, the young maid who was helping her with an inventory of the linens, stopped beside her. "That was Mr. Lawrence's wing, Your Grace," she said in a hushed voice. His Grace had it locked after it happened. No one goes in there. Penelope looked at the door. It felt like a wound in the house, a place of sealed-off pain. She simply nodded and turned away, making a note on her inventory sheet. "The linens in this press are badly moth-eaten. We will need to replace them." She would respect the Duke's privacy. The locked door was a boundary she would not cross. That evening, a storm rolled in, breaking the summer heat. Thunder rattled the window panes. Unable to sleep, Penelope went down to the library, seeking the comfort of the fire. As she approached, she heard a sound. A crash, followed by a muffled curse. She froze in the hallway. Peering around the doorframe, she saw Dominic. He was standing by the fireplace, his back to her. A decanter of brandy lay shattered on the stone hearth, the dark liquid pooling like blood. His shoulders were rigid, his hands clenched into fists at his sides. He was radiating a grief so raw, so potent, it was almost a physical force in the room. She knew she should leave. This was a private moment, a private agony, but her feet would not move. He seemed so utterly alone, a man drowning in a sea of silence. He did not turn. He did not seem to be aware of her presence. He simply stood there, staring at the locked door to his brother's wing, which was visible from the library window across a small courtyard. He was a sentinel guarding a tomb. Penelope took a half-step back, the floorboard creaking softly beneath her foot. He flinched, his head snapping around. His grey eyes, when they met hers, were not cold. They were ravaged, filled with a pain so profound it stole her breath. She expected anger, a sharp dismissal. Instead, he just stared at her, his face a mask of exhaustion and despair. 1 second, 2 seconds, 3. She did not speak. She did not offer empty words of comfort. She simply stood there, her presence a quiet acknowledgement of his pain. She was not intruding. She was bearing witness. Slowly, deliberately, he turned away from her and walked out of the library, leaving her alone with the scent of spilled brandy and the sound of the rain against the glass. She did not follow him. She knew with a certainty that settled deep in her bones that she had done the right thing. She had given him space. She had seen his private grief, and she had not tried to claim it or fix it. She had simply seen it, and it had made all the difference. The aftermath of that night in the library was not a dramatic change, but a subtle shift. The air between them, once glacial, had become something else. Quieter, more watchful. When Dominic looked at her now, he seemed to be seeing her for the first time. He began to join her in the library in the evenings. He would take a chair opposite hers, a book in his hand, though he rarely read. They would sit in silence, the only sounds the crackle of the fire and the turning of her pages. The silence was no longer empty. It was companionable. One evening, she was studying a book of architectural drawings of Thornhurst from the previous century. They had planned to build a folly on the western hill, she remarked, more to herself than to him. A Grecian temple. It was never completed. He looked up from his book. My great-grandfather ran out of money. My brother wanted to finish it. It was the first time he had mentioned Lawrence to her directly. The name hung in the air between them. It would have a fine view, Penelope said softly. Yes, he said, his voice rough. It would. And that was all. But it was a beginning, a tiny crack in the wall of his silence. A week later, a crisis erupted. A fever was sweeping through the tenants' village. Mr. Miller, the groundskeeper, came to the house, his face grim. The local physician was overwhelmed. People were dying. Without a moment's hesitation, Penelope took charge. She had the kitchens prepare vast quantities of broth and jelly. She gathered blankets and clean linens. She consulted the old herbal remedies in the estate's almanacs, remedies her own mother had taught her. Then she prepared to go to the village herself. Mrs. Graves was aghast. Your Grace, you cannot. It is not safe. It is not proper. It is necessary, Penelope said, her jaw set. As she was about to leave, Dominic appeared in the hall. He had been riding and was spattered with mud. He took in the scene, Penelope in a practical apron over her dress, the baskets of supplies, the worried faces of the staff. What is this? He demanded. There is a fever in the village, Your Grace. Penelope explained calmly. I am taking some supplies. He stared at her, his expression unreadable. She expected him to forbid it, to tell her it was not her place. Instead, he gave a curt nod. You will need more than broth. I will send for my own physician from Newcastle, and I will have the dray loaded with wine and firewood. Tell me what else you require. He did not offer to go with her. He did not usurp her authority. He saw what she was doing, and he provided the resources for her to do it more effectively. It was a gesture of trust, a partnership. For the next week, Penelope worked tirelessly. She moved from cottage to cottage, offering what comfort and aid she could. She bathed fevered brows, administered remedies, and sat with the dying. She was not a duchess performing charity. She was a woman doing what needed to be done. Dominic saw it. He would ride to the edge of the village, watching from a distance as she moved through the small, huddled cottages, a calm, steady presence in the midst of fear and sickness. He saw the way the tenants looked at her, with gratitude and a deep, profound respect. She had earned it. When the fever finally broke, and she returned to the great house, exhausted and heart-sore from the losses, he was waiting for her in the hall. He took the basket from her hands. His fingers brushed against hers. The touch was brief, electric. "You have done well, Penelope," he said, his voice low. He used her given name. It sounded like a prayer. She looked up at him, too tired to hide the emotion in her eyes. "They were your people, Dominic." It was the first time she had used his. His breath caught. He stared at her, and in the depths of his grey eyes, she saw the ice begin to melt. He saw not the Duchess he had purchased, but the woman who had stood by him in silence, who had tended to his people, who had called him by his name. "Yes," he said softly. "They are." From that day on, everything was different. They began to talk, truly talk, not just about the estate, but about books, about politics, about their childhoods. He told her of a lonely boyhood spent in his father's shadow, of the brilliant, reckless brother he had both adored and despaired of. She told him of her quiet, bookish youth, of a mother she had lost too young, and a father she could never quite reach. He started to smile. Real smiles. They were rare, and they transformed his harsh, handsome face, making him look younger, more vulnerable. He would seek her out in the gardens, in the library. He would bring her a strange wildflower he had found on his ride, or a book he thought she might enjoy. Penelope felt her own carefully constructed walls begin to crumble. She had not expected this. She had bargained for a life of quiet duty, not for the slow, terrifying, and exhilarating blossoming of her own heart. She was falling in love with her husband. The thought was both a joy and a terror. Their arrangement was one of convenience. What place was there for love in such a contract? Why had he stopped being so cold? Why had he started to see her? One sun-drenched afternoon, he took her to the western hill, to the place where the folly was meant to be built. They stood on the crest, looking out over the vast green expanse of Thornhurst. "Lawrence would have liked you," he said suddenly. He admired competence and courage. Penelope's heart ached for him, for the brother he had lost. "Tell me about him." And he did. He spoke of Lawrence's laughter, his charm, his impatience with the rules that governed their world. He also spoke of his recklessness, his gambling, the constant trouble he found himself in. For the first time, Dominic spoke not just of the golden boy the world saw, but of the flawed, beloved brother he had tried to protect. "The day he died," Dominic said, his voice thick with unshed tears. "We had argued. He wanted money, a great deal of it. I refused him. I told him he needed to be more responsible, that he could not simply charm his way out of every difficulty." He looked away, his jaw tight. He rode out in a fury. He was always a reckless rider, but that day he was angry. At me. The guilt was a raw, open wound. Penelope's first instinct was to reach for him, to tell him it was not his fault. But she stopped herself. Platitudes were useless against such a pain. Instead, she stood beside him, her presence a silent testament to her support. "You loved him," she said softly. It was not a question. He turned to look at her, his eyes filled with a world of pain and gratitude. "Yes," he whispered. "I did." He reached out and took her hand. His fingers, no longer cold and impersonal, were warm and strong. They laced with hers. It felt like coming home. They stood there for a long time, hand in hand, as the sun began to set, casting long shadows over the land. The fragile peace they had built felt real, tangible. But a storm was gathering on the horizon. A storm named Theodosia. The letter arrived on a Tuesday. It was addressed to the Dowager, but its contents quickly became the business of the entire house. Miss Theodosia Beaumont was coming to Thornhurst. She intended to stay for a fortnight, to pay her respects at dear Lawrence's grave on the anniversary of his passing, and to lend her support to poor Dominic in his time of trial. The Dowager snorted in a most un-Duchess-like fashion. "Support," she scoffed, tossing the letter onto the breakfast table. "The girl is a vulture, circling. She smells weakness." Penelope felt a cold knot tighten in her stomach. The peace she and Dominic had so carefully cultivated felt fragile, a delicate glass sculpture that could be shattered by a single careless blow. Theodosia's presence would be that blow. Dominic's reaction was a retreat into his old self. When told of her impending arrival, the warmth that had begun to light his eyes vanished, replaced by the familiar, shuttered coldness. He became quiet, remote. The easy conversations in the library ceased. He took to riding out for longer and longer periods, as if trying to outrun the approaching intrusion. Penelope's heart ached. She felt him pulling away, retreating back into the fortress of his grief, a place she was not welcome. Theodosia arrived in a flurry of fashionable luggage and dramatic sighs. She was dressed in a stunningly simple but clearly expensive gown of half-mourning lavender. She embraced the Dowager, kissed the air beside Penelope's cheek, and then turned the full force of her tragic beauty upon Dominic. "Oh, Dominic," she breathed, her voice trembling with artfully suppressed tears. She placed a hand on his arm. "How brave you are to be here. This place must hold so many memories." Dominic stiffened at her touch, but he did not pull away. "Theodosia," he said, his voice flat. "Welcome to Thornhurst." The atmosphere in the house changed instantly. It became tense, theatrical. Theodosia was the star of a tragedy of her own making, and she expected everyone else to play their supporting roles. She spoke of Lawrence constantly, her anecdotes painting a picture of a saintly, laughing demigod. Each story was a subtle knife, twisted in the wound of Dominic's guilt. She treated Penelope with the same pitying condescension as before, but now it was sharpened with a new edge of possessiveness. She took over the drawing room, rearranged the flowers, suggested changes to the menu. She acted as if she were the rightful mistress of Thornhurst, and Penelope a mere temporary steward. Penelope endured it with her usual quiet dignity. She retreated to her work, to the estate books, and her walks with Miller. She would not engage in Theodosia's games. She gave her husband his space, watching from a distance as he wrestled with the ghosts Theodosia had so deliberately conjured. The day of the anniversary arrived, grey and overcast. Theodosia made a great show of visiting Lawrence's grave in the family crypt, returning with her eyes red-rimmed and a single white rose in her hand. That evening, the air in the library was thick with unspoken tension. The dowager had retired early, pleading a headache, leaving Penelope, Dominic, and Theodosia alone. A fire crackled in the hearth, but the room was cold. Theodosia sat on a sofa, the picture of graceful sorrow. Dominic stood by the window, staring out into the deepening twilight. Penelope sat in her usual armchair, a book lying unopened in her lap. "He so loved this room," Theodosia said softly, her voice catching. "He would read poetry to me, here by the fire. Do you remember Dominic? He had such a beautiful voice." Dominic did not answer. His posture was rigid. "He was so full of life," Theodosia continued, her voice gaining strength. "He wanted so much. He only ever wanted your approval, you know. He looked up to you more than anyone." She looked at Dominic's stiff back, her expression hardening. "If only you had been easier on him, Dominic. If only you had not been so stern, so demanding. Perhaps he would not have been so reckless." The accusation, veiled for days, was now laid bare. It hung in the silent room, ugly and cruel. Penelope felt a surge of cold anger. This was not grief. This was a weapon. Theodosia was using Lawrence's memory to punish Dominic, to stake her claim on his pain. She looked at her husband. He had not moved, but she could see the tension in his shoulders, the whitening of his knuckles where his hands were clasped behind his back. He was absorbing the blow, accepting it as his due. And in that moment, Penelope knew she could not remain silent. She set her book aside with a soft thud. The sound made both Theodosia and Dominic look at her. "Grief is not a competition, Miss Beaumont," she said, her voice quiet, but carrying the weight of absolute conviction. Theodosia stared at her, her mouth falling slightly open in surprise. Penelope rose from her chair and walked to stand not beside her husband, but a few feet away, creating a triangle. She looked directly at Dominic, her gaze steady and clear. She did not try to defend him from the accusation. She addressed the truth beneath it. "It must be a heavy burden," she said, her voice softening with an empathy that was real and profound, "to grieve a brother whom everyone else claims to own, to have your memories dictated to you, to be told how you should feel." She was not talking about Theodosia anymore. She was talking to him. She was seeing him. Not the cold duke, not the grieving brother of a fallen golden boy, but Dominic, a man drowning in a private sorrow that everyone else insisted on making public property. Something broke in his eyes, a flood of emotion too powerful to name. He looked at Theodosia, but it was as if he was seeing her clearly for the first time. Not as the grieving fiancée of his beloved brother, but as a woman clinging to a past that was poisoning the present. He turned to her, and his voice, when he spoke, was gentle, but with an undercurrent of steel. "Theodosia," he said, "you have been a good friend to this family, but your presence here is no longer helpful. It is time for you to leave." Theodosia's face crumpled. The beautiful mask of tragedy dissolved, revealing the shocked, wounded woman beneath. "Dominic, I don't understand." "My grief is my own," he said, the words simple, final. "And Lawrence. Lawrence would not have wanted this. He was reclaiming his brother, reclaiming his own heart. He then turned to Penelope. The world seemed to narrow to the space between them. The air crackled. He looked at her, his eyes full of a raw, desperate gratitude. He said her name, and it was everything. Penelope. It was not the statement of a contract. It was not the address of a duke to his duchess. It was the sound of a man who had been lost in the dark and had just seen the first glimmer of light. It was the sound of a beginning. Theodosia left the next morning. There was no dramatic scene, no final confrontation. She departed as she had arrived, in a cloud of luggage and unspoken resentments. Penelope watched her carriage disappear down the long drive. She did not feel triumphant. She felt a quiet pang of sadness. Theodosia was not a monster. She was a woman who had lost her future and had tried to build a new one from the wreckage of the past. Her defeat felt as human and as sorrowful as the grief she had tried to weaponize. The house felt different after she was gone. The air was lighter. The oppressive weight of performed sorrow had lifted, leaving behind a quiet, clean silence. Penelope found Dominic in the garden later that morning. He was standing by a stone wall, staring at the overgrown rose bushes. He did not seem to be aware of her approach until she was standing beside him. For a long time, neither of them spoke. The silence was not empty. It was filled with everything that had been said and unsaid in the library the night before. Finally, he turned to her. His face was calm, but his eyes were full of a deep, turbulent emotion. "Thank you," he said, his voice rough. "I did nothing," she replied softly. "You did everything." He took a step closer. "For months, I have been drowning. Everyone wanted to tell me what Lawrence was, what I had lost. They built a monument to him, and they expected me to worship at it. No one saw that I was grieving a brother, not a saint. No one until you." He finally spoke about Lawrence. Not the charming, reckless boy of public memory, but his brother. He spoke of their shared childhood, of stealing apples from the orchard, of learning to ride on shaggy ponies. He spoke of the weight of the dukedom that had fallen on him when their father died, and the way Lawrence had seemed to resent his newfound responsibility. "I tried to protect him," Dominic whispered, the words torn from a place of deep pain. From his creditors, from himself. "I thought if I was hard on him, if I forced him to face consequences, he would grow up. I thought there was time." His voice broke. "I never thought there would not be time." Penelope listened. She did not offer excuses or platitudes. She did not tell him it wasn't his fault. She simply listened, her presence a quiet anchor in the storm of his confession. She heard the love, the frustration, the profound, unending guilt of the survivor. When he fell silent, his face etched with sorrow, she reached out and laid her hand on his arm. "You loved him," she said. It was the same thing she had said on the hill, but now it meant something more. It was an absolution. He covered her hand with his own, his grip tight, desperate. "Penelope," he began, his voice thick. He stopped, searching for words. He looked down at their joined hands, then back up at her face. "The day I sent that letter to your father," he said slowly, "I was buying a duchess, a functionary, a solution to a set of problems." He took a breath. "I was a fool. I did not know I was finding this." He gestured between them, at the quiet garden, at the shared space they had created. "The terms of our arrangement have changed," he said, his voice dropping to a low, intense whisper. "I do not want a duchess who runs my house. I want a wife who shares my life. I want you, Penelope, if you will have me." Her heart, which had been beating a slow, steady rhythm, began to hammer against her ribs. This was it, the precipice she had been both dreading and longing for. "I am your wife, Dominic," she whispered, her voice trembling slightly. "No." He shook his head, his thumb stroking the back of her hand. "You are the woman I have married. I am asking you to be my wife." The distinction was everything. He was offering her not a title, not a position, but himself. His broken, grieving, beautiful heart. She looked into his pale grey eyes, and for the first time, she did not see a duke. She saw Dominic, and she let him see her. Not the quiet, capable girl who had saved her father, but the woman who had fallen in love with him. "Yes," she said. The word was a breath, a promise. "Yes, Dominic." He lifted her hand to his lips, but this time it was different. It was not the cold, formal gesture from their wedding day. He turned her hand over and pressed a soft, warm kiss to the palm. His eyes never left hers. Then, slowly, as if he was afraid she might bolt, he lowered his head and kissed her. It was not a kiss of wild passion. It was a kiss of profound tenderness, of gratitude, of homecoming. It was a quiet confirmation, a sealing of a new bargain, a bargain of the heart. When he lifted his head, the world seemed sharper, more brightly coloured. The sun felt warmer on her skin. The scent of the neglected roses was suddenly, achingly sweet. He did not release her hand. He simply held it, his fingers laced with hers, as if he never intended to let go. He led her from the garden, back toward the great house that no longer felt empty, no longer felt sad. It felt like home. He led her past the library, up the grand staircase, past the door to her lonely suite of rooms. He led her to his own. And for the first time, he opened the door and drew her inside. Epilogue. 1 year later, the roses at Thornhurst were in bloom. They climbed the old stone walls in a riot of crimson and pale pink, their scent perfuming the warm summer air. The gardens, once overgrown and sad, were now a testament to patient, loving care. The house itself seemed to breathe more easily, its windows open to the sun. Penelope stood on the western hill, in the place where the folly was meant to be. The foundations had been cleared, and new stone was stacked nearby, ready. It was Dominic's project. Not a grand temple to a lost brother, but a simple, open belvedere. A place to watch the sun set. A place for the future, not the past. She rested a hand on the gentle swell of her stomach. The child, their child, was a quiet, steady presence within her. A promise. A pair of strong arms wrapped around her from behind, and a familiar chin rested on her shoulder. Dominic. "He is quiet today," he murmured, his hand coming to rest over hers on her stomach. "She," Penelope corrected gently. "She is contemplating." He chuckled, the sound a low, warm rumble against her back. It was a sound she had come to cherish, a sound that had been absent from his world for so long. He was still a quiet man. The deep well of sorrow for his brother had not vanished. It was part of him, a scar on his heart. But it no longer defined him. Love had not erased the wound, but it had allowed it to heal. Miller says, "We will have a good harvest," he said, his voice content. Miller is always cautious. I say it will be an excellent harvest. They stood in comfortable silence, watching the long shadows stretch across the land. Their land. Their life. It was a life they had built together, piece by quiet piece, built on a foundation of a cold contract, but cemented with the far stronger mortar of respect, of witness, of a chosen, deliberate love. Later, they walked hand in hand to the small family crypt, as they often did. They stood before the simple marble slab that read Lawrence St. Clair. Dominic placed a single wild bluebell, the kind that grew in the woods where they had played as boys, on the stone. The loss was still there. A quiet ache in the fabric of their happiness. But it was no longer a chasm that threatened to swallow them whole. It was a memory, honored and held, but a part of a much larger story. As they turned to leave, Dominic stopped and looked at his wife. The sun caught the auburn strands in her hair, and her eyes, when she smiled at him, held the deep, serene wisdom that had called him back from the darkness. He had bought a Duchess to solve a problem. He had found a woman who had saved his soul. He reached for her hand, his fingers lacing with hers. "Come," he said softly. "Let's go home." And together they walked back toward the great house, which was no longer filled with ghosts, but with the quiet, steady, and resilient sound of life. Thank you for listening to the story all the way to the end. Please tell us which city you're watching from, and what the story made you feel. Don't forget to subscribe, so you won't miss new stories.